17 minutes is a sliver of time. In 17 minutes, you can take a shower, or prepare a meal, or watch half of 2.5 Men. I was tempted with Charlie Sheen jokes this morning, though. But in the next 17 minutes, someone, somewhere in the United States will be dead. A victim of suicide, one of the 30,000 suicides we have every year in the United States. It wasn't that long ago that I slipped a plastic bag over my head, fed up with the depression that had sucked all the joy out of my life. But then I thought of something that Ernest Hemingway once said. The reason you not commit suicide, he said, is because you remember how swell life gets after the hell is over. Unfortunately, as some of you may know, Ernest Hemingway did not follow his own advice. Because in 1966, he put the barrel of a shotgun in his mouth and pulled the trigger with his big toe. I put a face and a name on mental illness as I tell my story, to realize that we're talking about a brain disease, not a character defect. Stigma is potentially fatal because people don't seek help when help is available, through medication, through counseling. It may be for you an elderly neighbor like Don Cornelius, the Soul Train founder who shot himself earlier this month. Or a young teenager, 15-year-old Drew Ferraro de la Crescenta, who jumped headfirst off the top of his school 2 weeks ago, dying in front of his friends. Or it may be a member of your own family. To give you better insight into what happens to someone who is so afraid of acknowledging that they have a problem that it leads them to the point of taking their lives. Jerry was a 35-year-old businessman. His father had given him a furniture store to manage, but because his drinking was so heavy and because he took so many pills, he ran the business into the ground. Jerry was diagnosed bipolar when he was in the Army, but the Armed Services said, we're not going to deal with it. They let him go without the help. And he was too ashamed of the stigma of being called, labeled crazy by his parents or by his friends or even by his wife to get help. So he did what a lot of people do. Daniel mentioned that a moment ago. He self-medicated with booze and prescription narcotics and would disappear for days on end, usually with another woman. His wife knew what he was doing. But one day, one time, one winter, he didn't come back. He had walked into the woods with a bottle of whiskey and a bottle full of prescription drugs and sat down at the foot of a pine tree and drank it all and took all the pills. 2 weeks later, a couple of hikers walking by spotted his body. They had to examine it with dental records in order to know who it was. He'd rather die than to admit that he had a mental illness. Teresa is another one. She started taking pills when she was a teenager because she was overweight, and so she took diet pills. And the diet pills graduated to, moved on to other kinds of pills. So by the time she was in her 20s, she was definitely hooked, and she would do anything for a fix, including writing bad checks. And on the third offense, she was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison for writing a check on her ex-husband's account. When she got out 5 years later, she decided to keep her life clean, so she went to NA, Narcotics Anonymous, went to meetings, did everything she was supposed to do. But the depression came back, and she couldn't tell anybody, or she felt like she couldn't tell anybody what was wrong. She would cut herself with scissors, being taken to the hospital, and the emergency room patched her up, let her go. Never referred her to a psychiatrist. I'm not sure she would have gone had she been able to do that. 7 years after she was released from prison, Teresa took an overdose of prescription narcotics and died on the couch in her apartment. 2 examples. 2 people. You know their backgrounds, you know the challenges that they have, and yet they had rather die than ask for help because of stigma. And I do believe there's a direct correlation between the high suicide rate we have in the United States and the stigma that we attach to mental illness. It's time for that to stop. That's why I tell my story. I tell my story because I want to put a face and a name on a mental illness. I had bipolar disorder. And when I was diagnosed in 1993, it came as quite a surprise because I thought I was just depressed. But then when a friend of mine observed that I was acting kind of crazy and scaring other people, and I should go see a psychiatrist and find out what's going on, and it wasn't until that point that I sat down in a psychiatrist's office and talked nonstop for an hour. And Dr. Tate stopped it and said, without a doubt, Mr. Roberts, you are manic depressive, and I'm putting you on lithium. When I tell my story, I tell it in 3 parts as a play. Well, part 1 is the diagnosis of the crisis. Part 2 is the diagnosis. Part 3 is the recovery. I want to emphasize the recovery part today because that is an integral part of the Turning Point Foundation. It's what you're all here about. Real recovery from an incurable disease. It's not going to go away. We can take medication to help control its symptoms, but we have to live with it. My crisis came, incidentally, the same year that the Turning Point Foundation was organized, 1988. In the spring of 1988, I was busy disorganizing my life. I was a college professor, a PhD candidate. I was married to the same woman for 18 years. I had 2 young children, ages 6 and 10. And I went to a mental hospital because I was depressed. And as I was sitting in the common area where we were playing cards, I think what we were doing, there was a man who suffered from schizophrenia that they had picked up someplace, and he was non-responsive, and he just stared at the wall, whatever he was doing. And suddenly he started laughing. And one of the ladies who was sitting next to me asked him, "Hey, Kenny, what's so funny?" And he pointed at me and said, "He's crazy." And you know, that was the best diagnosis I got. We're hard to catch. Anyone here with bipolar disorder, you know, we're hard to catch. When we're manic, we don't go to the doctor and say, "Hey, doc, I feel great, what's wrong?" We present the other side, the depression, so we are treated with antidepressants. In the psychiatric hospital, at least my first tour there, they gave me a brand new drug. Came out in 1987. It's called Prozac. And if we have any psychiatrists here, you know that you do not prescribe Prozac to a manic depressive. Well, it sent me to the moon. And in 3 days, I was ready to do what I'd always wanted to do, and that was to go to Hollywood and be a professional actor. I'd been acting for a long time. I'd done television commercials and little movie parts here and there, and I thought, hey, I'll do that. So I dropped my family. I dropped my college teaching position, broke the contract, and ran off to Hollywood. But I took along with me a lady that I had found at the psychiatric hospital. As you know from your knowledge of bipolar, that hypersexuality is one of the symptoms. And my hypersexuality was so prolific that Dr. Carol Lieberman, the media psychiatrist, wrote about me in her new book, Bad Girls. I covered 2 chapters, by the way. To get the book, she called me Sean. Just to protect the rights of the guilty. I wound up in Hollywood during the 1988 writers' strike. You remember that? That was the longest strike of the Guild. I didn't care. It all made sense to me. You know, when you're manic and you make these kinds of crazy decisions, it all makes sense. Well, I went off to Prozac when I got to LA, went to the deep depression, and then sneaked away in the middle of the night on a bus to go back to Arkansas. My wife wouldn't have me. The marriage was over. The university wouldn't have me back. My job was over. All I had were 2 little children who loved their dad desperately. And I got my monthly visitation with them for a weekend. I got as close to them as I possibly could. And it was during that time I was also learning about this disease and trying to come to grips with what I needed to do to recover, to make my life better. And that was where I found myself just asking a lot of questions. Why do I still have mood swings? What's going on here? What can I do to prevent that from happening? Well, what I found out is by coming to meetings put on by organizations like this, that I can learn from my peers how to manage my illness. The point I want to make to you, you do not suffer from a mental illness. You live with it. I like what Patty Duke says about her bipolar disorder. She wrote a book of brilliant madness. Recovery is an evolution. It is not an overnight experience. It is an evolution. I have evolved in the last 22 years. I know that recovery doesn't mean I'm going to be cured. I know it doesn't mean I'm going to return to a previous state. But I do know that I can evolve to be the person that I want to be. Daniel talked about his daughter being reunited during my manic time, and my daughter wouldn't even invite me to her wedding. That hurt. But in my recovery, it's a different story. She's given me 2 beautiful grandchildren. She is a nurse, a registered nurse in the emergency room at the Methodist Hospital in Fort Worth, Texas. And she told me recently, Dad, sometimes there's a bipolar person that comes in and gotten off their medication, things are going nuts. And what I tell them is, hey, my dad has bipolar. He takes his medication. He goes to counseling, and he's just fine. You do the same. So my experience hopefully can help other people in whatever way is possible. And sometimes it's through that broken relationship of a lost lost daughter. And now we're very close, and very close to my son as well. It almost wasn't like that. I could have made that decision. Go ahead and kill yourself, Tom. Just get it over with. You made such a mess out of life. Just get it over with. But I couldn't do it. I knew that if I continued to plod along sometimes, make a little progress here and there, help somebody else in some way, find that purpose in my life, and I'm doing what I believe is my life's purpose now, which is to share my story. The Turning Point Foundation is what I call a culture of recovery. It is where individuals matter. No degree of impairment make the matter less. I told you the story of Jerry and Teresa a couple of minutes ago. What if somebody could give me a glass of water down there? My mouth has gotten really dry. Thank you so much. There is more to the story that I left out. I always like Paul Harvey to sit down for the rest of the story. Jerry was my brother. His 7th birthday was the day after our mother died. I was 14. And I was responsible for taking care of him and our baby brother, Randy, who was 3. Because our grief-stricken father was often too drunk to be a parent. Our dad remarried 2 years later and brought into our lives a stepsister. She was Teresa. 2 suicides, 1 family, 5 years apart. Why? Because they were afraid to ask for help because somebody might say they were crazy. My brother could have been a grandpa like me right now. His boys are grown. They have had children. He's missing out on so much in life. For those of you who do not have a mental illness, you have a challenge before you. And that challenge is to do what you can to break down that wall of stigma that is keeping people from getting help. I always like what former President Bill Clinton said after the suicide of his close friend and Deputy White House Counsel Vince Foster back in 1993. You may remember that. The President said, "There's no shame in mental illness. But stigma and bias should shame us all." And for those of you who have a mental illness, whatever it is, I want to leave you with the words of a poem written by a country lawyer back in 1920. It's called Desideratum. Desiderata is a Latin term meaning desired things. You are a child of the universe, no less than the trees and the stars. You have a right to be here.
Back here on KADYTV.com with Tom Roberts, the speaker today at the Turning Point Foundation. How are you today?
I'm doing very well.
So in your speech this morning, you shared about your lifelong struggle with mental illness and how that impacted you from a long time. So why is it that Turning Point's important, and why come up here today to share your story?
I think the main thing is that I wanted to share my story for those with a mental illness, that there's nothing to be ashamed of, and to continue their work in getting help and support. And for those who don't know anything about mental illness, their families, for example, so much depends on how the family receives the information and can go from there to provide the adequate family support that's needed.
That's great. You talked about Bill Clinton and after one of his staff members committed suicide, and share that quote with us today.
Yes, Bill Clinton said after Vince Foster's suicide, Vince was his deputy White House counsel, but also someone he had known since he was 6 years old. And Bill didn't know very much. I call him Bill because I'm from Arkansas. Okay. He really didn't know that much about mental illness, but once he did, he said, there's nothing to be ashamed of with mental illness, but bias and stigma should shame us all.
I agree with you 100%. So what is the most important thing for someone to understand that isn't suffering from a mental illness, and how they could perhaps get involved?
I think the most important thing that they need to understand is that community-based, loving, accepting, they tell their friends and family, hey, we're not talking about a character defect, this is a brain disease. And they need to be able to work in that regard, and even go to the media. The media has a tendency to blow up things without, giving adequate explanation. Well, this person has a disease, they were not taking their medication, and that's what happened.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing your story today. If you're interested in helping the mental health here in Ventura County, reach out to Turning Point Foundation. And Tom Roberts, thanks so much for being here today.